Hey everyone, it's Nathan Orenstein with The No Show, here with the first episode of Cinema Showdown. With the lack of new movies coming out this year, I've decided I'm going to be ditching the traditional review format for the time being, and so let me introduce Cinema Showdown. We're going to be looking at the top 3 Best Picture contenders from the following year's Academy Awards and comparing them in 3 categories: direction, screenplay, and acting. I'm going to be assigning each movie a score of 1, 2, or 3, depending on how they stack up in each category. And at the end of the day, the movie with the most points wins. So for Cinema Showdown 2019, we're going to be looking at the top 3 Best Picture contenders from the 2020 Oscars, which were all movies released in 2019. So that being said, the movies we're going to be looking at are Parasite, 1917, and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. These aren't necessarily the 3 nominees that I like the best, but they're the 3 that were often considered to have the greatest odds of winning. Obviously, Parasite won this last year, but 1917 and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood were largely considered the runner-ups. So without further ado, let's start with direction. The winner for Best Director at the 2020 Academy Awards went to Bong Joon-ho for Parasite, even though Sam Mendes' work on 1917 was largely considered the frontrunner. Quentin Tarantino was actually placed 3rd on most betting sites, but it was largely a race between Mendes and Bong Joon-ho. The argument for Sam Mendes is very clear. He directed a one-shot film. It's really as simple as that, and to be honest, I can't argue with that. But here's the problem. Directing the hardest to direct movie is not the same as directing the best directed movie. So for that reason, I think the Oscars got it right in giving it to Parasite. I think that Parasite is definitely the best directed film of these 3, and it might have actually been the best directed movie of the entire year. There are plenty of scenes where the focus is constantly shifting in this movie, and Bong Joon-ho really feels like a puppet master with his execution. Characters leave and enter the scene at the perfect time, and the movie really moves with this impeccable rhythm. He also manages to make events that would sound absurd on paper work really well within the context of the movie and not feel out of place. And it's really obvious that Bong Joon-ho just had a perfect grip on his movie. But that is not to belittle Sam Mendes' work on 1917. As I said, this was certainly the hardest movie to direct, given its one-take nature. 1917 really pulls it off, and in my opinion, the most impressive aspect of the direction is that Sam Mendes is able to create a action-packed and entertaining war film that takes place in real time. And with that, it only revolves around a 2-character team, so you're not going to be getting any of those huge war set pieces that you would find in a traditional war movie. The problem with a lot of movies that take place in real time is that the pace can falter a bit. But Sam Mendes really guides the film along at a great pace that never feels stale. For me, though, there are a few creative choices in the movie that don't feel particularly organic. This is definitely a nitpick, but the name of the game is to stack these movies against each other, so I'm going to have to put 1917's direction slightly lower than Parasite's. And bringing up the rear, we have Quentin Tarantino with his work on Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. In terms of a creative direction, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood is easily Tarantino's least Tarantino movie. And I don't think this reflects on the quality of the film, it's just specifically with the direction, there's nothing that really jumps out and grabs you. The strength of the movie is definitely in its writing and its performances, both things we'll talk about later. But in terms of its direction, it feels pretty standard. That's not to say it's bad, but when compared to the giants that are Parasite in 1917, it just really isn't a competition. So for the first round, Parasite gets 3 points, 1917 gets 2, and Hollywood gets 1. Next, we're going to talk about the screenplays, and this year they all happen to be original screenplays. Tarantino was the favorite for a while, but at the very end, Bong Joon-ho swept in to take the lead in the betting odds and to eventually win the Academy Award as well. And again, I've got to agree with the Oscars here. Put simply, Parasite is one of the best written movies I've ever seen. It really just does everything right. The story is incredibly interesting and entertaining, while still tackling heavy themes like class discrimination, power, greed, and jealousy. It always keeps you guessing too, and it takes some really unexpected turns, but they don't feel shoehorned in or anything. The character development is also done really subtly and effectively. There's practically no exposition in this entire movie, but by the end, you really understand every character and their motivations. The dialogue is also extremely smart, with a lot of wit thrown in there too. Like I said, Parasite is just one of the best written movies I've ever seen, so it was obviously going to win this category in Cinema Showdown. But just because it isn't the best of the year, that doesn't mean Quentin Tarantino's screenplay for Once Upon a Time in Hollywood isn't great. In my opinion, this is easily Tarantino's funniest film. He's always been such a master at writing dialogue, and here it's so laid back and light that the characters really feel like they would actually say these kind of things in real life, which makes the humor hit even harder when it feels natural and real. Tarantino is also always able to craft characters that feel unique but also connected. Here, our three main characters are all people in different stages of their careers in Hollywood, and that really translates into how they act and talk to other people. But while the dialogue is great and the characters are great, the biggest flaw for me here is just an overall lack of narrative structure, with some scenes even feeling kinda tacked on. It's a movie that relies heavily on the success of each scene, and the overarching narrative kinda takes a backseat. And while I do think this works for the most part, it certainly isn't perfect and leaves more than a few cracks in the narrative overall. Last is 1917, which honestly isn't even in the same competition with these first two movies. In fact, I don't really understand how it was even nominated for Best Original Screenplay at all. Similar to Tarantino's direction with Hollywood, there just really isn't much to talk about with the screenplay here. Which is fine, 1917 isn't a movie designed around a screenplay, but in this category, it's gonna be ranked last. It's a bare-bones story with bare-bones dialogue and a few emotional punches thrown in here and there. And unfortunately, the two main characters just aren't that interesting either. That's about it. Parasite gets 3 points, Hollywood gets 2, and 1917 gets 1. Finally, we're going to evaluate the strength of each cast and their performances for each of these movies. And this was an insanely tough choice for me, but I ended up going with Once Upon a Time in Hollywood as the winner of this category. Obviously, we have to talk about the combined star power of Leonardo DiCaprio, Brad Pitt, and Margot Robbie all starring in the same movie. Leo is, of course, fantastic as always, and he really transforms into fading star Rick Dalton. The ups and downs of his career come with a lot of emotional turmoil, and Leonardo DiCaprio really is able to portray this emotional spectrum flawlessly. The real standout performance of the movie is from Brad Pitt, who plays Dalton's best friend and stuntman Cliff Booth, and Brad Pitt was of course awarded his first Oscar for this performance. Booth is just so laid back, content, and confident in his life, and Brad Pitt really captures that well. He's also one of the funniest characters in any Tarantino movie, and that's really saying something. Brad Pitt just makes Cliff Booth seem like such a real person while still maintaining that hilariousness I just mentioned, and really that's all we could ask for. Margot Robbie rounds out the cast as Sharon Tate, who is mostly there to bring a joyful and youthful perspective to late 1960s Hollywood. I'll admit her character is pretty underutilized, but Margot Robbie brings that charisma and just glow that you would expect from her, and she really makes Sharon Tate a likable character. The rest of the supporting cast is super entertaining and lively with their performances, and there just aren't any weak links here. Parasite was an extremely close second for me though. As opposed to Hollywood, the cast is just super self-contained, and everyone involved is excellent. The real standout for me is Kang-ho, who plays the father of the lower-class Kim family. His body language is incredible in this movie, and he's able to express the subtle emotions and difficulties that comes with being the leader of a lower class family who's faced with immense difficulties and strange situations. While he's the standout for me, the rest of the cast is really amazing too, and they each bring a performance that captures their character extremely well. It was practically a coin toss between Parasite and Hollywood for me, but at the end of the day, Hollywood barely edged it out. Finally, we have 1917. Really, all we have here are two leads, and I wasn't particularly impressed with either of their performances. George McKay and Dean Charles-Chapman are both fine, but that's about it. And to be honest, there were a few moments that Chapman's performance felt pretty underwhelming to me. The performances are certainly not the star of the show here, but for this category, it's going to end up on the bottom. So we have Hollywood with 3 points, Parasite with 2, and 1917 with 1. The final score for Cinema Showdown 2019 is Parasite with 8 points, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood with 6, and 1917 with 4. Congratulations to Parasite. Obviously, this is an extremely limited and ridiculous way to evaluate the quality of a movie. For example, I personally think 1917 is a better movie than Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, but in the format of Cinema Showdown, it just doesn't stack up. But I still think this is a fun and quick way to compare movies that were considered frontrunners at their year's Oscars. Let me know down in the comments below if you agree. And if you enjoyed the video, then feel free to like and subscribe. I've been Nathan Orenstein with The No Show. Thanks for watching.